It's not exactly a safe neighborhood, and to go out at night, you kind of have to know the neighborhood, really watch her back, and I think it's unfortunate she probably didn't know what kind of neighborhood she was in.
There is something almost mythological about Star Trek. For more than 5 decades, this franchise has occupied a unique place in human imagination, giving us starships, alien civilizations, philosophical dilemmas, and a vision of humanity's future that billions of people around the world have found genuinely inspiring. People have watched these episodes hundreds of times. They have memorized the dialogue, cataloged the stardate inconsistencies, debated the physics of warp travel, and built entire communities around their love for this universe. And yet, hidden within the very footage they know so well, are secrets that most of them have never noticed. Not because the secrets are buried deep or require special equipment to find, but because they are sitting right there in plain sight, waiting patiently for someone to look at them from a slightly different angle. The original Star Trek series aired between 1966 and 1969, produced on a television budget that would make modern streaming executives laugh. The crew behind the cameras was constantly improvising, problem-solving, cutting corners, and finding creative solutions to obstacles that would have stopped lesser productions cold. What emerged from that pressure was not just a television show, but an entire aesthetic philosophy, one where imagination compensated for resources, where human ingenuity filled the gaps that money could not. The remarkable thing is that this process left fingerprints all over the finished product, fingerprints that audiences watched for decades without ever quite seeing what they were looking at. Take, for example, the matter of James Doohan's right hand. Doohan played Montgomery Scott, the Enterprise's chief engineer, a character so beloved that the phrase "beam me up, Scotty" entered the permanent vocabulary of popular culture, even though it was never spoken in quite that form during the entire run of the original series. What most viewers never registered, despite watching Doohan operate control panels and wave his hands through countless engineering crises, was that his right middle finger was missing. Doohan lost the finger on June 6, 1944, during the Normandy landings on D-Day, where he served as a lieutenant in the Royal Canadian Artillery. He was struck by 6 bullets that day, for in his leg, one through his chest, and one that took the finger cleanly. A silver cigarette case deflected the chest shot, saving his life. He survived to become one of the most recognizable faces in science fiction history, and he spent that career keeping his right hand just slightly closed, positioned slightly away from the camera or operating machinery, in ways that naturally concealed the gap. When scenes absolutely required a close-up of both hands performing intricate work, the production quietly used a hand double. Specialized props were designed to be operated in ways that kept the right hand partially obscured. Doohan himself was apparently quite skilled at managing angles and positioning so naturally that even the people working alongside him on set sometimes forgot about the injury entirely. Millions of viewers watched him save the Enterprise week after week and never noticed what was not there. The costumes on Star Trek carried their own hidden history, and nowhere is this more interesting than in the armor worn by the Klingon. When these antagonists first appeared on screen, audiences responded to them as genuinely threatening figures, partly because of the performances and partly because the costumes communicated a sense of alien militarism with remarkable effectiveness. The armor looked hard textured, suggesting some kind of technology or material that existed far outside human experience. What it actually was, in at least some cases, was bubble wrap, the packaging material that people squeeze for stress relief. Costume designer Bill Tice, who was responsible for the visual identity of nearly everything the characters wore, had a guiding philosophy that distinguished him from other designers of the era. He believed that futuristic or alien aesthetics could be achieved not by creating entirely new materials from scratch, but by taking familiar materials and deploying them in contexts where their familiarity became invisible. Bubble wrap, painted and strategically placed, read to the eye as something structural and alien precisely because no one expected to see it in that configuration. Tice later explained that his approach to futuristic costuming was fundamentally about context, about the fact that any material could be transformed by how it was presented and what surrounded it. The Klingon looked fearsome. The bubble wrap worked, and audiences bought the illusion completely for decades. The props department operated with similar resourcefulness, and some of their solutions became so iconic that the original objects they repurposed are now collector's items in their own right. The distinctive bottles used to hold Saurian brandy throughout the series, those elegant alien containers that appeared in various scenes suggesting an entire ecosystem of interstellar beverages, were originally 1964 commemorative bottles produced by George Dickel Tennessee Whiskey. The bottles had an unusual powder horn shape that made them visually interesting, and the props team acquired them, made minimal modifications, and transformed them into alien artifacts through nothing more than context and presentation. The bottles appeared in both lighter and darker brown glass variants across different episodes, and they became so associated with the visual language of the original series that surviving examples of the original 1964 whiskey bottles are now sought by both Star Trek collectors and bourbon enthusiasts simultaneously. A sealed, intact original bottle from that commemorative release is genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. The props department also converted salt shakers into Dr. McCoy's medical instruments, repurposed household appliances into technical equipment, and found ways to make packaging materials read as control panel components. Every object in every scene was potentially eligible for transformation, and the department's skill at achieving that transformation became one of the defining characteristics of the show's visual identity. The credits themselves contained a story that most viewers sat through without reading carefully enough to understand. William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy were the two central figures of the original series, Kirk and Spock, and their professional relationship was complex in ways that extended far beyond the screen. One manifestation of this complexity was embedded in the contractual language governing how their names appeared in the opening credits. Nimoy's contract contained a specific typographical clause specifying that his credit had to appear at no less than 75% of the size used for the star's name, meaning Shatner's name. This was not a casual agreement or a gentleman's understanding, but a precisely documented contractual obligation with a specific percentage attached to it. Beginning with the fourth aired episode, the production records show explicit notes about implementing Leonard's credit is to be no more than 75% of the type that we afford to William Shatner. The credits were physically measured and adjusted to maintain this differential. When earlier episodes returned for network rebroadcast, the typographical adjustments followed them. The irony is that audiences watching those credits were looking at the product of careful negotiation and contractual precision, at a mathematical relationship between two names that reflected the entire complex power dynamic between two actors, without having any idea that the font size they were casually reading was actually a carefully enforced legal document made visible in plain sight. The star field through which the Enterprise appeared to travel was itself a construction so clever and labor-intensive that it is hard to appreciate without understanding the technical constraints of the era. There was no computer-generated imagery. There were no digital tools of any kind. Creating the illusion of a starship moving through space required physical objects, optical equipment, and a great deal of patience. The production team used an Oxbury optical printer to create their space environments, a machine capable of performing reductions and enlargements with continuous automatic focusing. Artists painted black stars on white backgrounds measuring roughly 2.5 by 3 feet, then photographed those canvases and tracked them in multiple directions using different mattis for each pass. The various movements were then superimposed at different speeds, creating the layered illusion of depth and motion. For stationary background stars, the team punched holes of varying sizes through large sheets of black paper and backed them with diffusion screens and color filters. A single ship flyby sequence might require an entire day of filming with the motion control equipment, and any sequence involving multiple ships could extend to a full week of work. The result, when it all came together, was a starfield that communicated the genuine vastness of space in ways that audiences found convincing enough to never question. The craft involved in building that illusion was extraordinary, and it existed entirely behind the scenes, invisible to the people it was designed to persuade. Some of the secrets hidden in Star Trek are not technical achievements, but rather continuity errors that accumulated across the production process and then survived into the broadcast footage without anyone catching them. One of the most interesting of these appears in the third episode of the original series, Where No Man Has Gone Before, in a scene where the villain Gary Mitchell uses his developing godlike powers to create a gravestone for Captain Kirk. The stone reads James R. Kirk. Throughout the rest of the entire series, across every episode, reference, and characterization, Kirk's middle initial is T for Tiberius. This error was recognized relatively early in the show's run, and the question of what to do about it generated genuine discussion. During the remastering process decades later, the visual effects team considered digitally correcting the R to AT, but ultimately decided against it because the rotoscope work required would have been disproportionate to the benefit. The solution that was eventually embraced came from Gene Roddenberry himself, who explained through writer D.C. Fontana that Mitchell had godlike powers but remained fundamentally human, and humans make mistakes. This explanation is elegant in its simplicity and slightly absurd in its implications, but it satisfied the logical requirements of the established universe and allowed the error to remain without breaking continuity. The R on that gravestone has been sitting in that episode for more than 50 years, correctly identified as wrong, officially explained as intentional human error, and still slightly unsettling every time a careful viewer catches it. The exterior shots of the Enterprise contained their own hidden secret for viewers who looked closely at the registration markings on the ship's hull. Throughout the series, careful observers eventually noticed that in certain shots the NCC 1701 designation appeared reversed, as though the footage had been flipped horizontally. This was not an accident in the careless sense, but rather a deliberate production technique with a practical motivation. When visual effects teams filmed the Enterprise model against a background, they occasionally captured unwanted elements in the frame, most commonly the Earth or other recognizable objects that had no business appearing in scenes set far across the galaxy. Rather than reshoot the expensive model footage, which would have required significant additional cost and time, the effects team simply flipped the negative horizontally to remove the problematic background elements from the visible area of the frame. The flip removed the Earth, but also mirrored everything else, including the ship's registration numbers. The result was footage that worked perfectly well for its narrative purpose, while containing this small, detectable anomaly visible to anyone who thought to look at what the numbers actually said. For decades, most viewers watched those reversed registry markings without registering that something was backwards there. Brains accepting the general shape of the text without processing its actual content. The insignia worn on Starfleet uniforms carries a historical footnote that even dedicated fans frequently get wrong. The arrowhead emblem that Kirk and his crew wore is commonly understood to represent Starfleet as a whole, the universal symbol of humanity's interstellar organization. But in the context of the original series, as it was actually conceived and filmed, that interpretation is incorrect. The arrowhead was the specific emblem of the USS Enterprise. Different ships had different insignia, and episodes that featured crews from other vessels showed those different designs clearly: a circle with a spike for the Exeter, a hollow delta for the Defiant, a spiral for Starbase engineers. Gene Roddenberry had a military background and understood the tradition of unit-specific insignia, and he built that logic into the design language of the show. The arrowhead became universal only after the original series ended, when the decision was made for narrative and practical reasons to standardize the design across all of Starfleet. The in-universe explanation developed was that Kirk's crew had achieved such legendary status that their ship's emblem was adopted as the symbol for the entire organization, an honor reflecting the magnitude of what the 5-year mission had accomplished. It is a satisfying explanation, but it obscures the fact that for the entirety of the original series, the arrowhead that everyone now recognizes as the symbol of all Starfleet was meant to mean something far more specific. Hidden throughout the corridors and engineering sections of the Enterprise, if you know what to look for, is one of the longest-running inside jokes in television production history. Pipes and conduits throughout the ship carry a label reading GNDN, followed by numbers and color codes. To the casual viewer, these markings look exactly like the kind of technical notation that a real starship might use to identify its various systems, the sort of plausible detail that production designers include to make fictional environments feel inhabited and functional. What GNDN actually stands for is Goes Nowhere, Does Nothing. The label was created by John Jeffries and other members of the original set design team to identify pipes and conduits that were purely decorative, structural elements of the set that had no fictional function whatsoever. The joke was that the labeling system itself was part of the fiction, that the Enterprise's designers had been so thorough they had formally cataloged even the non-functional elements. The labels appeared consistently enough across enough episodes that they created a genuine visual language, and that language was built on an acronym that the production crew found privately hilarious. The joke survived and propagated. When the Deep Space Nine team built replica Enterprise sets for the 30th anniversary episode, they included GNDN markings as a deliberate homage. Modern Star Trek productions have continued to include references to the label, creating a thread of continuity running from the 1960s to the present day, all of it originating in a group of set builders who wanted to make each other laugh. The Phasarius, the massive spherical alien vessel that confronted the Enterprise in the Corbomite maneuver, created a lasting impression of enormous, pulsating alien technology. The episode itself is considered one of the strongest in the original series, and the ship plays a significant role in establishing the sense of genuine danger and mystery that the episode depends on for its emotional effect. The Fascinates was built from ping-pong balls. More precisely, it was constructed from a base structure covered with ping-pong balls cut in half and arranged to create its distinctive textured surface, then enhanced with lighting effects designed to make it appear to pulse with internal energy. The model was conceived by Matt Jeffries and constructed with the understanding that it would be filmed slightly out of focus.